When I first bought the Camaro, it had 1970s era fiberglass fender flares that were pop riveted to the quarter panels. I removed them and I could see they were covering up rust, holes, and rusted outer wheelhouses. My plan was to replace the outer wheelhouses and put on quarter skins. I removed a section of the quarter panel to see what I was dealing with. I was working on the roof at the same time, so I changed my plan and decided to replace the entire quarter panel. There was prior damage on the right rear corner, which I found when I was stripping the paint off. I removed the outer wheelhouse and stripped off the old undercoating from the inner wheelhouse. I was surprised to see the original ash gold paint overspray underneath the undercoating. When I started removing seam sealer at the shock tower, I could see rust and light shining between the panels. I made a brace from square steel tubing and tacked it between the trunk floor and the trunk hinge to support everything and keep the hinge in its original location. I removed the inner wheelhouse and started cleaning off the metal there. That's when I discovered that there are 3 layers of metal by the shock tower and they were rusted through and falling apart. I took off the top layer to see how bad it really was. I ended up cutting away the bad metal on the inner panel and making a patch panel, which I welded in place. I bought a shock tower patch panel, which is the uppermost layer of the metal. I cleaned up the surface rust that was still there and covered everything with a rust encapsulator. I welded on the shock mount, fitted that panel, and welded it in place. I ground the weld smooth and sprayed everything with epoxy primer. The next thing I did was to fit the inner wheelhouse in place and weld it in. Then I fit the outer wheelhouse to the inner and welded it in place as well. I fit the full quarter panel on, using the original tulip panel and trunk gutter to keep everything aligned perfectly. The next part to deal with was the rusted tulip panel. I cut it off in sections, making sure not to damage the inner panel, which is part of the package tray and includes the upper trunk gutter. I cleaned off the surface rust, covered it all with a rust encapsulator, and then sprayed all of it with epoxy primer. The new tulip panel and the quarter panel were screwed in place, and it was then time to repeat the process on the driver's side. I started cutting away that quarter panel and cleaning off years of dirt, undercoating, and Bondo. I decided it was best to replace both the inner and outer wheelhouses on that side. I welded the steel brace between the trunk floor and the trunk hinge once again and removed both pieces. As expected, I found rust holes around the shock tower, so I cut off the upper layer of metal to expose the mess underneath. I cut away all the bad metal, made a patch, and welded it in place. Then I had to repair a hole that had been drilled into the trunk by a previous owner. The metal was rusted and thin, so I cut the bad metal out, made another patch, and welded it in place. I cleaned up the surface rust and covered it with a rust encapsulator. I made a patch for the upper layer of the shock tower and welded it in place. Then I fit the inner wheelhouse, welded it in, and then fit the outer wheelhouse to the inner wheelhouse, and I welded that in place as well. I ground all the welds smooth and sprayed everything with epoxy primer. I fit the quarter panel on, screwed it in place, and put the trunk lid back on so I could make sure that the gaps were correct. None of the outer sheet metal was welded yet, since I still had to make repairs to the trunk and fit a new tail panel in place. I'm sure that you'll wonder why I repaired the shock towers and didn't just replace everything with a new trunk pan. The answer is simple. The trunk itself wasn't in terrible condition, and I'm building this car in a one-car garage. I just don't have the space to try to manipulate an entire trunk pan into place. My next job was to finish the trunk area and the tail pan, and that's more work for a different video. Thanks for watching.